We're here at Apple's October launch event in Brooklyn, and people are screaming for some reason. I don't really know why, but it just might be because Apple completely redid the iPad Pro. We're about to take a look at the new 12.9-inch model, which by far, to me at least, is the most interesting of the two new updated iPad Pros. Let's take a closer look. So this is, in fact, the 12.9-inch iPad Pro, and I know what you're thinking. 12.9 inches, that has been a thing for iPads in the past. The thing to keep in mind is that this, despite having a screen that's just as big as the older iPad Pro, is noticeably smaller. It's actually surprisingly light and very thin. This is just under 6 millimeters thick. That's, for my Android people out there, that's pretty close to Moto Z territory. What this means in practice is that this is a device that is remarkably comfortable to use with one hand. That's something I've never been able to say about the original 12.9-inch iPad Pro or the model that came after. I've been using this for a little bit since we got here to the demo area. I've just been picking it up, kind of holding it around in my hands. This is a remarkably comfortable device to use. Again, which is insane considering how big this thing is. Now, the display obviously is part of what makes this iPad so special, but we also have to talk about the fact that there's very little stuff around it now. The bezels have been reduced dramatically to the point where you only have a few millimeters of material going around the display at any given time. Right up top, you have the true depth sensor for FaceID. That includes a 7-megapixel camera for front-facing selfies and portraits. What's really interesting, though, is that Apple says you can theoretically pick up this iPad and use it in any orientation. It just sort of follows you. But it is important to note that if you cover up this side, the iPad will say, camera's covered, maybe pick it up a different way. So something to keep in mind as you start getting acquainted with this device. The other thing to keep in mind is that this display is what Apple calls the liquid retina, which is, in some circumstances, similar to what we got in the XR, but the big difference is this keeps the same resolution as every 12.9-inch iPad we've used in the past. I don't remember the exact resolution off the top of my head, but it's just as pixel dense, and for my money, it's just as pretty as those earlier displays too, which counts for a lot because this is a tablet that starts at $1,000. You can dial that price up if you really want to go for it. This is something you can actually get with up to 1 terabyte of storage. That in itself is a really interesting direction to move into because it does make the iPad Pro feel more than ever like an actual computer. That sort of perception is amplified by the fact that we have a USB-C port here down at the bottom instead of the traditional Lightning port. Now what that means is you're going to be able to connect peripherals to the iPad that you would have required dongles or accessories in the past. One of the demos that Apple showed off during its keynote presentation was the ability to perhaps hook up a camera directly to an iPad and shoot photos and have them appear directly on the screen for tether capture and editing, which is super, super cool and something I would never dare try with an existing iPad. We also have to point out that the A12 Bionic chipset inside the iPad Pro, both versions, is remarkably quick. It's a slightly faster version of what we got in the XS and XS Max, and just based off of jumping in and out of different apps, watching this soccer game sort of unfold, we'll jump out of that, we'll fire up DJ to sort of get some tracks going and sort of get some visuals synced up as well. There's a lot happening at one time, and I'm actually trying pretty hard to flummox this thing, but it's not having any of it. I'm jumping in between all of these open windows. I've got my split view going on here. This is going tremendously quickly. This is maybe not something that's completely new. We have had very fast iPads in the past, to be sure, but this level of power, I think, is really going to give people more of an argument to perhaps give up their traditional computers in favor of something like this. There are more accessories that don't require this USB-C port. One of them is, of course, this keyboard, which now attaches to the entirety of the iPad's back because the smart connector has been moved from the side of the iPad down to basically its butt. On the right side, we also have a curious little port here. That's to let you know that you can plug in your Apple Pencil and have it charge. It's a massive improvement over the old, I'm going to flick off my cap and plug it into my Lightning port because A, you're always going to lose that cap. I've lost countless. And B, having one of these sticking out just feels dangerous. With Apple's hardware refresh, that's no longer an issue, and frankly, we're looking at a much more elegant design and experience as a result. Oh, and while we're talking about the Apple Pencil, we do need to discuss the fact that it itself has received a pretty big upgrade. Obviously, there's that flat side that allows you to magnetically attach it to the iPad and charge it that way, but you can also double tap it to jump between different presets. By default, in the iPad itself, you're able to switch between some very specific presets, but third-party developers will be able to bake in support for that double tap into their own software, so you'll be able to double tap, for example, in Photoshop to jump between zoomed in and pulled out views, which will be very interesting to see kind of operating in real time. I'm looking forward to kind of understanding how app developers make use of that. After all, this is a $100 accessory. It was always good in the past. This has the potential to make it truly valuable, but we'll have to see how it goes. A couple more really quick things to note. We have a 12 megapixel camera around back. That's actually the same wide angle sensor that we've seen in the 10S, 10S Max, and the 10R. It is important to note that while you can shoot selfies with that 7 megapixel true depth front facing camera, you can't get portrait mode going on the back, even though the iPhone XR did allow for that. I should also point out this is an LTE model, so you do have some pretty noticeable antenna bands running around the back. They're very noticeable, but I don't think that's a huge deal. And I don't think, more importantly, it detracts from the cleaner, sleeker look of the new iPad Pro. It's much more angular. It has, I think, much more in common with devices like the iPhone SE and some of the Macs that Apple has worked on, especially the Mac Mini, which itself is kind of a beautiful machine. The older iPads went for a sort of classic, friendly, rounded design, and that sort of, I think, helped people get acclimated to them very quickly. But by revamping the design in a very specific way, Apple seems to have given the iPad Pros a very significant visual differentiator. This is not a toy, although it does certainly work as a great games machine. This is a machine that is kind of premium. It's meant to get things done, and for the first time, its design really reflects that. So yeah, Apple has been saying for a long time that iPads represent its vision for the future of computing, and I think we're kind of actually getting there. On the hardware front, at least, it's undeniable that the sort of power that Apple's bringing with the A12 Bionic, with the storage options, with the USB Type-C port, this is important stuff, and it's going to allow people to use the iPad Pros in ways they just couldn't before. Whether the software is ultimately enough to get people thinking about this as more than just an iPad, that remains to be seen. But if nothing else, we're looking at two of the best iPads that I've ever used, for sure. And I think it just might be enough to get people really thinking about what they want to do and how the iPad could maybe get that done for them.